Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Royal Institution and the Glossop Lectures. We'll begin with a safety moment. The fire exits are located here, and the evacuation location is wherever furthest from the building. Can I also ask that you turn your mobiles off or to silent, please? The engineering group Glossop Lectures celebrates the past, present and future of engineering geology. The theme of tonight's lecture is time. As geologists, we're all used to considering the past, but increasingly we are being asked to apply those lessons to the future in order to predict the impact of climate change and anthropogenic activity. I'm Dr. Ursula Lawrence, and I'll be your time-travelling guide for tonight. We are honoured to have the ongoing support of the Glossop family, and I'm delighted to welcome Glossop's daughter Emma and son-in-law John to the Royal Institution tonight. Time passes on many scales, varying between longer geological time and shorter human lifespan. We remember tonight the recent passing in 2020 of Professor Peter Fuchs, former chair of the engineering group, who presented the first Glossop Lecture in 1997, titled Geology for Engineers, the Geological Model, Prediction and Performance. Also, more recently, in October of this year, the passing of Professor Paul Marinos, who presented the sixth Glossop Lecture in 2002, titled Ongoing Challenges in Engineering Geology for Tunnelling in Difficult Ground. I'd now like to introduce a nonconformity as we switch to the future. The Glossop Award is the Engineering Group Rising Star Award and is made to an outstanding young engineering geologist or geoenvironmentalist. The recipient is chosen through open competition, comprising a presentation based around a set theme. All entrants this year were to an extremely high standard, and the judging was made more difficult by having a choice of 3 themes. The winning presentation answered the question, what is the impact of groundwater, including extreme weather and/or climate change, on your project? I'd now like to introduce the 24th Glossop Award winner, Josh Dunlop of Jacobs.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Josh Dunlop. I work for Jacobs. I'm an engineering geologist there. I've been there 2 years since I graduated from the University of Leeds. And today I'm going to speak to you about the impact of groundwater, including extreme weather and climate change on my project, the Middlewich Eastern Bypass. Some of you in the crowd may have put the words witch and groundwater together and guessed this might be about halite, and you'd be correct. So my agenda, quickly run through a bit of an introduction to the project. I'll talk about the ground model and the groundwater models. I'll then go through about the impact that groundwater has had on the site to date. I'll then talk about the potential future impacts that we may see in the future and round up with a bit of a conclusion. So the project, like I said, is the Middlewich Eastern Bypass. It is approximately 3 kilometres of new highway to the south and east of Middlewich Town Centre in Cheshire. It's mostly at grade, sort of small embankments and cuttings. However, there are 2 bridges towards the south of the scheme there in that blue box. One that crosses over the Northwich Sandbach Railway and one that crosses the Trent Mersey Canal. And the parties, according to CDM regs, are Cheshire East Highways as the client, we have Balfour Beatties and Ringway Jacobs as the principal contractors, and we have ourselves, Jacobs, as the designer. From the offset, I have to say that there is some confidentiality issues and restrictions on what I can say, as this project is ongoing at the moment. So at the start of the job, we looked at the freely available data available to us, and that diagram on the right-hand side shows a strat column. Beneath Middlewich, you can see that there is 2 significant thicknesses of halite. We've got the Wilkersley and the Northwich, and they are sandwiched between mudstones of the Percy mudstone group, namely the Brooks Mill, the Witch and the Biley mudstones. In particular to Middlewich, we're concentrating on the top 2 there, the Brooks Mill and the Wilkersley halite. The diagram on the left is a section through Middlewich, which is similar to what we have. We have this collapsed strata, residual strata of the Brooks Mill mudstone over this area of wet rockhead of the Wilkersley halite. And before we did any sort of intrusive investigations, we determined that the main risk, geohazard to the site would be voids, particularly sort of semi-static voids within the Wilkersley halite, which may permeate the surface. So a bit about dissolution then. There are 5 main karstic rocks in the UK. They are dolomite, limestone, chalk, gypsum and salt. That diagram on the left-hand side there shows in the Cheshire Basin we are underlain by Triassic salt and gypsiferous rocks. If you just go to the right-hand side of that same diagram, you can see that salt karst and gypsum karst have the highest dissolution rates and increased dissolution as well. To quantify this a little bit, halite has a solubility of about 350 grams per litre, which is 2 orders of magnitude higher than gypsum and 3 orders of magnitude higher than limestone. A lot of us will probably know this already subconsciously. If you've ever put salt in your sibling's glass at the dinner table, it disappears pretty quickly. If you did the same with limestone, you'd probably get a whack round the head. For everyone else who's well behaved at the dinner table, we have a video on the right-hand side which may show this. Hopefully that works. Oh no, it doesn't. Basically, that video would have shown with similar ground models what we have at Middlewich. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Could you mind muting that? Sorry, I'll explain over it. Thank you. So a similar ground model to Middlewich. We have sort of a granular layer above this sand, which would represent the Brooks Mill mudstone, and we have this white layer beneath, which would obviously be our Wilkersley halite. And as fresh water is introduced into the system, you can see that the salt disappears and that void space is occupied by the overlying strata and there is surface deformation. I'll just let that play out. Thank you. We also did a bit of a quick experiment on site. We had 2 lumps of similarly sized core samples from the Wilkersley halite. The sample on the left there was put into a bucket of brine, and the sample on the right was originally the same sort of size and was put into a bucket of fresh water. After a couple of hours, we came back, and obviously the results speak for themselves there. You can see the sample on the right-hand side has significantly shrunk, and we actually think that it's only stopped shrinking further because the water had reached saturation point. And you can see, hopefully, that there's some sort of orange crystals of halite still within that sample. So basically what we're trying to conclude here is that these are rapid, this can happen really rapidly if conditions allow. But the towns of Cheshire are not disappearing at rates of sort of centimetres and metres per day. So what have we got as current conditions? This diagram is what we think is happening with the groundwater model beneath Middlewich. So we know that there's the relative density of a fully saturated brine is approximately 1.2. Compare that to fresh water, which is 1. We assume that therefore there's a sort of interaction where the fresh water floats above the saturated brines, similar to sort of how oil slick sort of floats above fresh water. Within the ground model then, we have sort of 10 metres of glacial till, 50 metres of Brooks Mill mudstone, and anything below 60 metres below ground level was Wilkersley halite. And somewhere within the Brooks Mill, we have this interface where the fresh water above floats above the sort of saturated brines, and this prevents further dissolution occurring within the Wilkersley and the lower portion of the Brooks Mill mudstone. So we sort of like understand that there's this protective blanket. We need to understand then how previous dissolution occurred in the past. And to do that, we go way back to the Triassic, when these rocks originally formed, in the fault-bound basin of the modern-day Cheshire Basin during the break of the Pangea. This basin would have had influxes of salt water, and as the salt water evaporated, that would leave behind these halite crystals, which would eventually form the thick successions of halite we have. And then there'd also be occasional wind-blown sediments, which caused the build-up of these mudstones. At some point between then and now, if there's any fresh water induced into the system, they could potentially cause dissolution within either the Brooks Mill or the Wilkersley halite. and this fresh water would then potentially open up small voids within the Wilkes Loop. We can sort of imagine two scenarios. There's like localized and regional dissolution. Localized may result in human activity, for example, where brine pumping forces water being pumped for industrial reasons to flow towards a certain point. As the water is flowing, it will obviously choose the path of least resistance, and obviously it's far easier to flow through a void than it is through salt and rock. Any water that is then pumped through this pathway, if there's any undersaturated groundwater, it makes this void bigger until the overlying strata can no longer bridge it. When it can't bridge it, it collapses into the void and causes this upwards migration of the void. And this eventually leads to a surface expression on a sort of smaller, localized scale. In a regional sense, if we have a widespread drop in the brine interface that I mentioned a minute ago, this leads to far more of the halite being susceptible to dissolution, therefore far more voids, far more collapse, far more surface deformation. Let's put a bit more context on it then. So Cheshire has been a centre of brine exploitation for centuries, sort of especially between the 1800s and the 1970s. Extraction was uncontrolled and unregulated, and the result was frequent catastrophic collapse. I don't imagine the residents of them houses bought them like that, so this is probably evidence of localised subsidence. In a regional context, it's a bit different. We think that the lowering of the brine interface actually occurred during the retreat of the recent glaciers in the Pleistocene. So this diagram on the left shows the current configuration we have at Middlewich, which is the brine interface well above the level of wet rockhead at the top of the halite, and obviously there's far less halite being dissolved at this point. On the right is what we think happened during the glaciation and the retreat of the wet-based glaciers during the Pleistocene. There is the water table and the groundwater head of water was sufficient enough to push the brine interface down to deeper levels, expose a lot more of the halite to dissolution. These would then cause, like I said before, more voids, more collapse, more surface deformation. So, did we find any evidence of either localised or regional subsidence during our ground investigation? Localised subsidence was probably best exhibited during our non-intrusive investigations. This picture on the left here is a microgravity survey done in Middlewich. Just for reference, that little brown mark down there is the railway, and this is just to the northeast of it. The blue area is a negative residual boogie anomaly, and it indicates that the ground at this area is less dense than the surrounding sort of reds and orange colours. We also did seismic surveys. So this is along seismic line L2 that you can see on the microgravity. Just to put a little bit of context on this as well, our chainage 100 on this seismic line roughly correlates to the centre of that blue area. And on the refraction surveys, we've got a bit of interpretation there at 100 chainage. There's sort of these shallow, poor refractions. We also did reflection along the same line, and this was probably our biggest indicator and our most obvious indicator of localised subsidence. The yellow line at about 60 metres is the top of the halite. You can see that it's broken at about chainage 100 and not as strong. There's also this area of strong reflections and sort of disturbed reflections at chainage 100, and there's a vertical fault alongside it. Hypothetically, freshwater may have used this as a pathway to get down to the top of the halite and the collapse in an upward fashion to the ground surface. Funnily enough, when we went to site for walkovers, there was no sign of this blue area. It was originally marked on historical maps as a pond. However, when we got to site, there was no evidence of it. It was only from our non-intrusive geophysics that we found this. For whatever reason, the farmer just didn't want a 2.5 metre hole in his field. In terms of regional subsidence, it's probably best exhibited in our intrusive investigation. The picture on the right is a typical example of the Brooks Mill mudstone core that we recovered. It's sort of small millimetre to centimetre clasts within a muddy matrix on sort of the right hand side of it. And it also varies to sort of class supported breccias on the left hand side with far less of the muddy matrix, depending on how disturbed and how weathered the samples were. We also have evidence of sort of secondary precipitation of minerals as well. The pictures on the left, that fracture within the grey zone on the second core down, we have what we think is reprecipitated halite. The halite further down in the sequence was a bit more pure and translucent and sort of pinky in colour, whereas this stuff seems to sort of incorporate maybe impurities and clastic material where it has been originally dissolved and reprecipitated at a different depth. Just a bit of a recap then of what I've said. Regional dissolution has occurred, and this has caused the majority of the collapse breccia. And there's also anthropogenically induced dissolution, which has possibly led to localised subsidence features across our site as well. So, I mean, fortunately, we have found no evidence of pre-existing voids, which is our main worry at the start of the GI. But how about the future? So we have previous dissolution methods and mechanisms. How do we assess the impact going forward then? Well, to do this, we use Hutton's principle of uniformitarianism. The present is key to the past, and in our case, key to the future as well. We know that in the past, the main mechanism for dissolution and surface deformation is the alteration of the protective brine blanket. So what is our design going to do that could potentially alter this blanket? I think Tony Waltham said in the 2015 Glossop Lecture, control the drainage. This is something we can control as part of our design process. For example, we've been in communication with our drainage team quite a lot, and we've said under no circumstances are suds ponds have to be lined, Under no circumstances are we to have soakaways that lead directly into the ground surface. We used brine during our ground investigation as a flush, and we backfilled any boreholes that penetrated into the Wilkersley. This is just to reduce the easy pathways for fresh water to percolate down to the halite. We're also in sort of a difficult period of dynamic climate change at the moment. There's a lot of unknowns that we have to try and factor into our design as well. Again, we've been speaking with our drainage team, and they've accounted for a 1 in 100 year event for capacity for all our culverts, all our flood compensation areas, all of our drainage ditches. However, we've also factored in resilience into this in terms of climate change, especially in the northwest of England. It's already quite a wet region. The unknowns in the next 100, 120 years in terms of sort of surface water availability is an unknown. So they've actually factored the designs by 1.35 on top of this as well to account for any sort of excess rainfall in the next sort of years. We also have to acknowledge, though, that there is this latent background risk of developing above soluble strata. It is a natural process, and we can control as much as we want, but it is a natural process, and there is always this blatant background risk. So just before I summarise everything, I'll explain this diagram, this picture on the right. This is the seismic truck that was used to do the seismic surveys that I showed a few slides ago. This is actually next to the Trent and Mersey Canal, and the rest of our site sort of goes in a northeast direction into the page there. I just found it funny that this building in the background, this grey ominous industrial building overlooking us the entire time we're on site, is actually owned and operated by British Salt, who are actively pumping salt out of the ground, brine out of the ground at the moment. So it was a nice reminder every time we got to site that we were investigating something that they may well have caused. So just to summarise, the impact of groundwater has been profound on Middlewich. The changes in the groundwater regime have led to dissolution of the Wilkersley halite member. In turn, this has caused collapse in the overlying Brooks Mill, and our ground investigation broadly agrees with this hypothesis. And we have to acknowledge that there is always this latent background risk associated with soluble strata, despite controlling what we can in terms of design. So just to conclude then, groundwater has had a profound impact on the surface geomorphology and the subsurface characteristics of the stratigraphy beneath Middlewich. Understanding the geological and groundwater processes that have induced historical dissolution is fundamental in assessing the risk of future subsidence on our site. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Josh. I'm sure you'll all agree a worthy winner. The Engineering Group Glossop Medal Award is our Lifetime Achievement Award, which is awarded to somebody who's made an outstanding achievement to engineering geology. I'd now like to call upon Dr. David French, former Managing Director of Atkins Ground Engineering, to introduce the 21st Glossop Lecturer, David Shilston, Atkins Technical Director for Engineering Geology.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to you all in this wonderful setting here. It is indeed an honour and gives me great pleasure to introduce to you past President David Shilston, who will this evening present the 21st Glossop Lecture. David has a working career as a hands-on engineering geologist that spans over 40 years. After 10 years working for two major site investigation contractors, David joined the Atkins Geotechnical Division in 1988. I joined Atkins a couple of years later, so I've been a close witness to the rise of David's career and stature in the industry over a long period. He's been a great support to me in my career and in the development of the Atkins geotechnical community. David's 40 years experience encompasses a wide variety of civil engineering, building and geological projects in the UK and in many countries and terrains overseas. Building on the rich and valuable experience gained on these projects, in recent years David has focused on developing his and his team's expertise in the assessment and management of geohazards, especially for problems encountered during the construction of very large-scale projects, including international pipeline routing. David has also specialised in international arbitration, which, because of the very large sums of money at stake, requires exceptional standards of rigour and dedication to the task. In reading an advanced copy of tonight's lecture, I was of course reminded of the many projects and collaborations I've enjoyed working on with David over the years. Picking out a couple, an early experience that comes to mind of relevance to tonight's lecture was an expert opinion case of mine on a piling project at Boomer in Northumberland. David came to the site and we spent a happy time walking together along the nearby coastline, where we examined the exposed cliffs of boulder clay and other nearby geological exposures. In an instant, the reason for the piling problems came to life in front of us. It was a salutary reminder to me, a mere geotechnical engineer, of the fundamental importance of a conceptual geological model as the first step in the investigation and design of any civil engineering project. All the better, of course, if the conceptual model is laid out in reality before you. Another favourite memory of David in action was at an Atkins Energy Geotechnics Forum about 10 years ago, with a large audience of clients, academics and staff present. David gave a talk on terrain evaluation, which was replete with dramatic photos of all sorts of geohazards, major projects gone seriously awry. And as we were at the early stages of wind farm development in the North Sea, a reconstruction of woolly mammoths marching magnificently across Doggerland during the last ice age. His talk was strategically placed just before the morning coffee break, and I can remember well the excitement generated and imaginations captured amongst the audience. We had been transported TARDIS-like back in geological time. David has achieved much recognition during his long career path amongst colleagues, clients and industry alike. Highlights include author or co-author of over 50 published technical publications, scientific papers and conference presentations. Atkins Fellow and Professional Head of Discipline for Engineering Geology at Atkins. President of the Geological Society of London from 2012 to 2014. President of the Earth Science Teachers Association from 2016 to 2018. And recipient of the 2018 Koch Medal in recognition of his contribution to science and service to geoscience. In preparing this short introduction, some of David's key qualities that stood out to me are his exceptionally rigorous approach to engineering geology. He applies the utmost rigour in everything he does. His energy and infectious enthusiasm, which is the lifeblood of any project or venture. His dedication to the teaching and development of early career geologists and geoscientists, and above all, I think, his ability to bring geology to life for geoscientists and lay people alike. These qualities are amply demonstrated in tonight's lecture, Tools of the Trade, Engineering Geology and the Geoscience Time Machine. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome the 21st Glossop Lecturer, David Shilston.
Well, good evening, everyone. I've got a technological challenge here. I have to press 2 buttons to change every slide. So in order to enable me to do that, I'm going to take my jacket off. Just got to get this going. At this end. Right, we're ready to go. So you'll have seen the abstract in the advertising blurb, and just to summarise it here for you today, how did geology and geomorphology of a site get to the way it is today? What are the practical engineering geological applications of that knowledge to civil engineering or to environmental projects? And I think the answer is much more than just simply a description of geological materials or geomorphology or even a site's history. It requires a time machine. It requires a mental time machine, the geoscience time machine. It's traditional to begin a Glossop lecture with citing some of Mr. Glossop's work himself. And I'm sure most of you in the room will be familiar with the first 2 quotes there, which are fundamental truths, really, aren't they? If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find much of value, and what you look for should be suggested by the natural environment. But there's a third quote there that isn't often cited, and I think is really important. Mr. Glossop was a geotechnical engineer, but he recognised the importance of engineering geology. And he says that you've got to understand the geology in order to do your geotechnical engineering at the very start of the project, which he describes as the geological structure of the site. If you read his Rankin lecture, from which this comes, you discover he doesn't mean structural geology, as we might have been taught in the first year at university. What he means is the overall structure of the geology, the nature of the geology of the site. And he says that if you get that wrong, then everything else you do is so much labour in vain. Professor Peter Fuchs, the first Glossop lecturer, gave his lecture on geological models. And I've included here an extract from one of the beautiful models that are in his paper by Jeff Pettifer. And Peter Fuchs talks about the importance of models and how, in particular, the power of the model is more than its ability to just anticipate, but it can't predict. The anticipation is turned into reality by ground investigation. Well, what is the time machine? What was it that got me going in this kind of way? I was asked, when I was invited to become the Glossop Lecturer, and of course I accepted, I was given a fortnight to think of a title and what it's going to be. So this is what I came up with. Now, one of the underlying themes in the way I think about things is this book by Ian Mortimer, The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England. And I'm going to read you this little quote. Imagine you could travel in time. What would you find if you went back to the 14th century? Imagine yourself in a dusty London street on a summer morning. The wooden beams of houses project out over the street. Painted signs above the doors show what is on sale in the shops beneath. Suddenly, a thief grabs a merchant's purse near the trader's stalls, and merchants run after him, shouting. Everyone turns to watch, and you are in the middle of all of this. And what Ian Mortimer says is, as soon as you start to think about the past as happening, as opposed to having happened, a new way of conceiving history becomes possible. So the idea of the time machine is that you go to geology where it is happening, and it helps you understand it. Some early excursions of the time machine. I think this beautiful etching is the first reconstruction of a geological scene in the English literature by Dunlop in 1830. And as you can see, it's got the pterosaurs in the sky, the turtles, the ichthyosaurs, ammonites. This is the Jurassic of the Jurassic coast, reconstructed in 1830. A couple of decades later, a Victorian could visit the past. These are the Crystal Palace dinosaurs on the southern outskirts, the southern part of London. And so a Victorian could get out of the tube train at Crystal Palace station and go and visit and stand by these reconstructions of prehistoric animals from the past. So this is a Victorian Jurassic Park, an attempt to reconstruct the past, including a reconstruction of the geology. Look at the red circle there. You can see the oolite, the lias, the new red sandstone. So this is an entire geological environment rebuilt, so the time travelling by the Victorian public there. But I also started to think, what is a modern example of time travelling? Have we done it in the modern times? And then it suddenly occurred to me, yes, we have. Dr. Jack Schmidt is the only geologist to have visited the moon, did so in 1972, and spent 22 hours wandering the lunar landscape. The moon is a very ancient celestial body. The surface is many millions of years old. So in getting out of his time machine, in this case the lunar module, he is stepping back in time. And as he said when he gave a lecture at the Geological Society a few months later, man was there to see for himself. So why do we want to use the time machine? I suggest to you that the geoscience time machine can be a tool in engineering geological practice. It helps us envisage, investigate, understand the conditions and the processes of the geological past. When I showed an early version of my paper to a colleague, he said, but David, how do you use the time machine? Well, what's the manual? What are the operating instructions for the time machine? Well, here they are. First of all, you must employ the fundamental principles that underpin modern geoscience. The law of superposition, the principles of uniformitarianism, Walther's law. And I'm sure you in the room here will have other laws and things that you think underpin what you do. You get out of your time machine and you say to yourself, where am I? Am I on a hillside, in a riverbed, on a landslide, on a beach? And what is going on here? Can I understand this environment in terms of geological processes and geological materials? Then, using our normal techniques as espoused by Professor Fuchs and many others, develop a model through field observation, through mapping, through understanding the regional and local geology and so forth. And you take this understanding, you take it back today, and you apply that to your geotechnical engineering and your engineering geological work. So in my lecture tonight, I'm going to go through a few case history examples. We're going to go to the Lambeth Group strata in London. We'll talk fleetingly about Alfred Wegner and continental drift, visit a karstic limestone, a British earthquake, some gas pipelines in the Sahara. We'll go mammoth hunting in Sussex, and we'll end up offshore at a wind farm. So the Lambeth Group is well known, I'm sure, to many, but just in case there are people listening in who don't know about the Tertiary of the London Basin, I've put 3 quotes down here to get us going. So the Lambeth Group is sedimentary strata deposited in the Tertiary period, laid down in embayments on the eastern margin, on the western margin rather of the North Sea. And most importantly, during deposition, there were 3 cycles of sea level rise and fall. And as the last quote there, which is from Professor Haidt and his team who produced a Syria report on the Lambeth Group, these small variations in sea level have a big impact on the complexity of the strata. So the changes of environment are very important. And as quoted there from Jackie Skipper, the middle quote, this is all taking place in a subtropical environment. This is a table that I've compiled based on some work by Jackie Skipper with additions from Professor Haidt and Tim Newman to show the cycles in the Lambeth Group. Cycle 1, Cycle 2, Cycle 3. And you can see they're separated. They begin with transgressions, that is a sea level rise, and they end with an unconformity in the sea level pulling away. Just zooming in on the table, here is Cycle 1 and the beginnings of Cycle 2. And as you can see, the oldest strata, oldest are at the bottom of this table, of course. So there's a shallow marine incursion. Then the sea level changes relative to the land and the conditions become estuarine. And eventually you're into terrestrial conditions and pedogenic processes take place. That is soil formation. And one of the most important of those pedogenic processes is the cementing of the ground near the ground surface, forming calcrete, forming creted layers. And this can be expressed in models. The model on the left is from Jackie Skipper's and her team's work, looking at just a simple cross-section through the strata, and you can see, I hope, in white are the calcretes just below the mid-Lambeth hiatus, which is the unconformity. And then the Haidt et al. 3-dimensional model showing a particular landscape, but also revealing the geology at depth. It took me a long while to find a photograph that might illustrate what the Lambeth Group looks like. Jackie, Skipper and I exchanged a large number of emails, but eventually I stumbled across this image which comes from the Getty collection, and I'm allowed to use it. So this is the River Zambezi. It's not a close analogue, but it just gives you the impression. So you could imagine getting into your time machine and visiting somewhere like this. If you landed in the far distance, you'd be on the terrestrial terrain where the pedogenic processes are happening. If you came nearer the camera, you would be in river channels with sandbars, sand channels eroded into estuarine deposits, for example. It's not a good match, but it's a good mental image to get you going in your thinking. But also, you can look at the Lambeth Group by getting close to it. You could dig a tunnel. So this is one of the Thames Tideway tunnels, and Tim Newman kindly got me permission to use this photograph, and it shows the mid-Lambeth hiatus, which is that red arrow. So beneath it is the calcretes, and beneath that are the tropically weathered soils, those multicoloured soils that are so famous for the clays within the Lambeth Group. So if you were to go where that red arrow is, you would be standing on the unconformity. You'll be standing on part of the former land surface or just below it. And the grey clays above are the marine clays that come in with a rise in sea level. And of course we have to think about the geotechnical implications of all of this. So I've taken this little quotes from the Syria report that I've mentioned previously, and it's got many chapters on various aspects of the engineering of the Lambeth Group. But here I'm talking about deep excavations and dewatering. And I believe that the time machine approach, placing yourself back there in time, in your mind at least, will improve your ability to get design parameters, become more reliable. You make better estimates of excavation methods required, including the strength and understanding of the 3-dimensional disposition of the calcretes, and then the dewatering and groundwater conditions. So within the clays, which are very impermeable, are channels of sand channels, which have radically different permeability. To understand all this in 3 dimensions, I believe getting into your time machine mentally and having a go will greatly improve your understanding. So in summary, Yes. In summary, the geotime machine, in this case, enables the engineering geologist to have an improved understanding, to integrate and interpret the surface and subsurface data, to increase the reliability of what we do, and particularly the design parameters, and reduce the assessment of ground risks and the assessment of opportunities. Geology isn't always about finding problems, it's about finding solutions. So say you take that tunnel, the Tideway project had to have a tunnel there. But if you had a choice, you could put the tunnel above or below the calcrete. But you've got to understand the calcrete in order to be able to avoid it. Alfred Wegner was writing before the Second World War in 1929. And I happen to own a book, a copy of his 1929 publication, but it's been translated into English. It's the most beautiful, excellent translation. He must have written very well. And I'm very proud to say that my copy of Wegner's translation was given to me by Professor Fuchs, so I keep it on a special place in my bookcase. But we've just redrawn a couple of Wegner's drawings here to illustrate how perceptive he was. Remember, this is 1929, decades before plate tectonics was even thought of in these kinds of ways, writing before the war. But look how perceptive that right-hand drawing is, which is the Eocene. But the reason for showing you this is to emphasize and to show that plate tectonics and continental drift underpins everything we do. It's one of our guiding principles. And this is a drawing by Jeff Pettifer. It's very intricate. I'm not expecting you to read it all. That's in Professor Fuchs's Glossop Lecture. It's time. So on the left-hand column is time from the Precambrian working to the top, takes you to the Quaternary in the present day. And it shows the position of the British Isles, indeed the assembly of the British Isles, over geological time. Beginning down in the Cambrian, and the British Isles travelling north. Notice how in the Silurian, the British Isles were 30 degrees south of the equator. By the time we get to the equator, we're in the Carboniferous period, approximately, and therefore it's not so surprising that the Carboniferous period for us in the British Isles included tropical rainforests. It's the Congo. So, and as the British Isles moves further north, you get into the Permo-Triassic, and you're in the equivalent of the Sahara. I know this is a gross simplification, and there are many other things that affect the climate, but it does give me, I find this a very useful diagram. It gives me a way of thinking my way through geological time. And the diagram also shows the importance of tectonics there. This case history is about a limestone in Devon, a Devonian limestone near Ashburton in Devon. Now, Atkins has been involved for some years with this particular quarry, and we've been assisting with various aspects of the quarry, including seeking planning permission for an extension and other matters. Confidentiality forbids me or precludes me from saying much about the quarry, but that doesn't matter. I don't want to talk about the quarry. I want to talk about the limestone itself, and I draw your attention to the straight road that is just behind the quarry, behind the crushing plant. You can see it behind the trees there. And the reason I've chosen this is that there are this wonderful publication by Brian Hawkins and Peter Fuchs in 1988 that talks about the problems encountered in building a small overbridge over that A road. They encountered limestone, and this is a photograph from their paper in the Quarterly Journal. But the photograph's quite difficult to understand. So I've inserted here some red lines, and the red lines separate pillars or ribs of limestone. Where the red lines themselves are is clays. So we have ribs of limestone with karstic features between them, forming the ribs, filled with superficial deposits. Tony Waltham, in his Glossop Lecture, presented a classed classification scheme, and this is a coloured version of that. And I think that the conditions of the limestone that I'm talking about in Devon are similar to what we see where that red arrow is there. So there's subsidence sinkholes and an irregular rockhead. We don't have the other features, but that's part of it. So if we zoom in, this is the conditions that we're talking about here. An irregular pinnacled rockhead overlain by superficial deposits and the weathered residue of the limestone, and then sinkholes forming above the cavities. Now, the limestone is Devonian in age, so it's of considerable geological antiquity, but now it's near the surface, and for some geological time in the past it has been near the surface. So I want to take us back to the Tertiary, which, as we've seen, with the British Isles is in a tropical condition or subtropical. But there is a period in the Tertiary where the climate was much warmer, and that's called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, PETM. And I've shown on this drawing, which we've redrawn and simplified from a drawing by Morley, and we've added some colour, to show you what the PETM looked like. So the British Isles and Europe, Western Europe, mainland Europe, is in that red ellipse. And you can see from the scale, I hope, that that dark green is megathermal rainforests. So our site in Devon was in the Tertiary in tropical conditions, and for some time was in a very severely tropical conditions with rainforests. This will have considerable effect on the weathering. So I tried to find a picture that would illustrate this for you, and here it is. So Professor Cam Nelson from New Zealand has allowed me to use this photograph. It's a karst near Waitamo in New Zealand, which is famous for its karstic conditions. It's difficult to gauge the scale of this photograph, but I hope you can see the grass at the bottom and the bushes which look like gorse bushes. So we're talking about karstic ribs and pillars that are a few meters high, no more. Very similar to that old black and white photograph from the bridge foundations. But after the Tertiary comes more modern times, and in the last 500,000 years or so, we've had at least 4 really big glacial epochs. So our landscape has been subjected to a glacial environment. Now, that part of Devon, that part of southern England, was never glaciated. It was always in a periglacial zone. So for a considerable number of thousands of years, that landscape was in a periglacial condition. So you think periglacial, you think solifluction sheets, that kind of thing. And this is a wonderful photograph taken from Alaska of a solifluction lobes currently in operation. You could imagine in your mind's eye landing the time machine just where the photograph has been taken from and looking at these wonderful solifluction sheets and lobes coming down the hillside. That is what our site would have looked like, because there's one thing I've not told you, which is that the limestone in the quarry and on the highway is in a topographic low. So the hillsides to one side look just like this. So in the Ice Age periods, they weren't glaciated, but they had tens of thousands of years of conditions like this, bringing the material from the hillside down over the outcrop of the limestone. And the materials on those hillsides are slates, mudstones, sandstones, siltstones. Ideal materials for creating solifluction sheets. When I think about solifluction, I think of the work of Professor Chandler, and this diagram always comes to my mind. So this is some long time ago, the solifluction and active freeze-thaw conditions in the island of Spitsbergen in the Arctic. This is what we have in our mind. This is where the time machine could be visiting conditions like this. An active layer that's bringing material down the slope, and permafrost and shattered rock at depth. But the other reason that I chose this case study is that the authors, Hawkins and Fuchs, published some borehole logs. And these are the borehole logs they publish for the A38 Catton crossover bridge. And all we've done is take a copy from the Quarterly Journal and colour it up for ease of presentation tonight. So the limestones are blue, there are clay layers, or clay bodies in grey, and superficial deposits above, including superficial deposits that contain lumps or blocks of limestone, as in borehole 52A. The problem was that some people working on the project had attempted to correlate these layers in the limestone. So they correlate the clay layers across the cross-section. Very difficult thing to do. But the important thing there is that if you look at the limestone in outcrop, it doesn't have any clay layers. This limestone only has massive, crystalline, slightly metamorphosed Devonian limestone, which has been tectonized. So what is going on here? If we look at the next slide, The paper publishes one borehole log, and this is 52A, the one I drew your attention to earlier. And as you can see, we've used the same colouring, so limestone is blue, the clay layers are this grey colour. But if you zoom in and look at the clay layers, look what the description says. Firm brown clay with fragments of shale, sandstone and limestone. Where's that shale and sandstone come from? They've come from upslope. They've come from the slope wash, from that solifluction, from the periglacial conditions. So these aren't layers of clay. These are cavities within the limestone that have been filled over geological time. So we're clearly dealing with a karstic landscape. So when you think about where we would take the time machine, you can imagine getting out of your time machine at Rockhead, rather like that example from New Zealand, thinking about those conditions, and then thinking about those conditions that I showed you in Alaska, thinking about how superficial deposits have come over and blanketed the karst, which is now hidden, but is still there. Let's go somewhere else. This is Essex, which is in southeastern England. And this is the Colchester earthquake. So the Colchester earthquake is probably the largest onshore earthquake in recorded earthquake history in the British Isles. And I'm using this example because I want to talk about the use of historic documents. So we're not going back far in time, and we have documents to think about. And the reason that I was working on this project was that I was a lowly member of the Central Electricity Generating Board's Seismic Hazard Working Party, which was led by the late Dr. Brian Skipp, who passed away only recently. And the CEGB wanted a reassessment of the UK earthquakes in order to reassess their functioning nuclear power stations, to check that they were sufficiently well designed for the kind of earthquake that modern science would estimate would be there. So the task that I had, principal task in that project, was to evaluate particular earthquakes, working with colleagues, and we used the MSK intensity scale. So intensity is the amount of local vibration that you get at an earthquake in any given place. It's not magnitude, which is the total amount of energy released by the earthquake. And in order to assess historical reports of the damage that an earthquake did or the effects it had, we need to have a scale. And the MSK scale enables you to do that systematically and repeatedly. And because this earthquake was sufficiently large that it damaged buildings, I'm going to talk about building damage. And the first thing you need is to be able to classify your buildings. So here we have very poor rural structures, a type A, brick buildings of a more conventional type, half-timbered structures, a B, and then a modern timber building would be C. So that's the classification of the types of buildings. You then need to classify the damage. Fine cracks, fall of plaster, windows breaking, that kind of small damage, grade 1, right through to grade 4, sections of brick walls falling, or grade 3, cracks in big brick walls. So you can contour your assessment of the impact of the earthquake. And the contours are called isoseismal lines, and you can see here. So this, the epicenter of the earthquake is intensity 8, and that's right by Colchester, and the effects were felt right out to beyond Birmingham. So in Birmingham, intensity 3, you'd have to be in quite a sensitive position to feel that. You'd have to be lying down or sitting down. Intensity 4, which goes through London and Cambridge, a lot of things would rattle, perhaps things would fall off shelves. On the right here, we have a zoom in of the individual results for individual villages. Now, we assessed two types of data. The first type was reports in newspapers. There's an enormous amount of newspaper reporting in the Victorian period, but the problem is it's quite flamboyant, just in newspapers today. There's an inevitable exaggeration because they're trying to sell the newspapers. So it's quite difficult to evaluate reliably the intensity of an earthquake from a newspaper. But for this earthquake, we had a number of properly prepared scientific assessments, including one by gentlemen Meldola and White, who did a study in the immediate after the earthquake. And you can see, I hope from the map on the right, that the epicentral area isn't at Colchester, which is slightly up in the centre of the drawing, but is around the village of Peldon. So one thing I had to do, or I did, was to go down to Colchester and look at the building stock. Because in order to understand the individual reports, we had to understand the buildings properly, beyond the level that I've described to you in the MSK scale itself. And I defined 3 types of building. So there's a timber frame building, think of an Elizabethan timber frame building, something like that, which has plaster, rendering, weatherboards, called that type X. Then we have type Y, which is a timber frame building that's been upgraded by someone, the owner, who wants to make it look more modern. And more modern buildings are made of brick, but for whatever reason, that owner didn't want to knock down the existing building. So they clad it, they made it look like a brick building, but underneath it's timber. And this is not a good mixture of characteristics, because the timber frame building in an earthquake will wobble, rather like a wobbly dining room table. But the brick, veneer, is very fragile, and will peel away with the timber bashes against it. So we're looking at a very vulnerable structure here. And this is the type of structure that produces very photogenic images or sketches in the record. And then we have brick buildings. So these are modern brick buildings, modern villa style. Remember, we're talking of the 1880s, villa buildings, schools, public buildings, something like that. So these 3 types of building behave in a very distinct way. So this is a type Y building. It's at Peldon, so it's right in the epicentral area, and you can see the man with the bowler hat, and just to the right of him is a young lad, and behind the young man is a brick wall that's peeled away. You see, the timber frame building is essentially okay, but the brick wall has fallen away. So we need to understand what level of intensity could have caused this type of damage in a type Y building. It'd be very easy to overestimate the intensity if you didn't understand how it was built. But this is a villa. This is Strood Villa, also in the epicentral area at a type Z building in Peldon. Looks okay, but let's zoom in. So look at the chimney stack. It's been wrenched. Wrenched is a commonly used word in earthquake reports. The chimneys were wrenched. But also look at the parapet above the door. It doesn't look too badly damaged until you read Meldola and White's description. So the Strood Villa in Peldon, one of the worst cases of destruction that came under our notice. The building, although modern, 24 years old at the time, substantially built of brick, was without exaggeration wrecked. So there were a few examples like this in the epicentral area that enabled us to pin down with much greater certainty the intensity. So when we assessed intensity 8, it had a much better certainty and reliability. But the other thing we need to think about is the social context of Colchester at the time, in 1884. And we wrote in the paper, which was led by Brian Skipp, we wrote in the paper, the earthquake arrived after a long period of economic decline of the entire district. Impact was hard felt, particularly on the self-employed artisans whose homes and means of production were damaged. So it was the whole area was going through a bad time. What does that have with regard to the maintenance of these buildings, whose damage we're trying to assess? And looking at a bit more detail, the town of Colchester itself was run down. It was prosperous in previous years, but by the mid-1880s, it had become a rather sleepy country town, we wrote. And the countryside was also in decline. The 1880s was quite a long period of deep agricultural decline in southern England and in other parts. So to go back, the town and area around Colchester, including the epicentral area, was not in good heart when the earthquake took place. So this was also fed into our understanding. We place ourselves back in time to understand the context of the scientific data that we are gathering. Oops. Now, in Meldola and White's big, thick report, which you can borrow from the Geological Society Library if you so wish, they have a table. And the table gives a summary of a relief fund, the Mansion House Relief Fund, Mansion House in London. So this is the City of London providing funds to alleviate the distress of the local people. So this graph, which I've plotted the intensity that we assessed on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have a rather strange ratio. It's the number of buildings that were repaired according to the table in Meldola and White, as a ratio of the number of inhabitants again according to the table. So this is a crude way, or a way of measuring the proportion of buildings that were actually damaged. So this is the scale on the right is completely independent of any assessment that we might make. And I was fascinated, and we've replotted this, removing one small error and adding a trend line. There's a very clear trend there, except for one place, East Oniland. Now, why is East Oniland different? I don't know the answer. Is it a typographical error in the original Meldola and White publication? Or is there something special about East Oniland? For example, were the buildings in more or better condition than elsewhere? Or did they have, for example, a vicar who was very well connected with the city and could get more money to his parish? I don't know, and I regret we didn't investigate this, but drawing the trend line really brought it home to me. So in summary then, we can use the time machine in relatively modern times by placing ourselves back in time using the historical documents and understanding them correctly. So if you take the picture of Colchester on the left, which came from a newspaper, indeed the spire of that church did fall down. But notice the chimneys, they're still intact. And that's why the intensity in Colchester was assessed much less. And we can use this kind of understanding of the past through historical records on geo-environmental projects, if we're investigating, shall we say, a former steelworks or a gasworks. To understand where all the components of that factory and manufacturing plant were is really important. And to place ourselves back in time when they were making town gas, for example, will help us understand the ground conditions. We're now going to North Africa. We're going to the Insala gas project in Algeria and the South Tunisia gas project. Both of these are pipeline projects. And our task in this, or my task as part of a team, was to help assess pipeline routes. I know this photograph is from the Oman, but it's such a lovely photograph I couldn't resist using it. So here we have a pipe trench being dug. The trenches are normally dug sufficiently deep that the pipes themselves have about a metre of cover over the pipeline itself. And here the ground conditions are so hard that a hammer breaker is having to be used. So these are creted deposits. These are jury crusts. And that is part of what we were being asked to look at, because the evaluation of trenching rates is critically important for the production rate and therefore the cost of pipeline construction. So here's one of my favourite photographs that I took in South Tunisia, gas pipeline project. So in the distance we have rolling hills, which are being leading down to a plain where there's a road, and I'm standing on the edge of a wadi, on an ephemeral stream that flows away from the camera towards the road. And you can see it's got shattered rock at the ground surface, and then there are sand dunes coming in. Deserts are not all sand dunes, as you can see. And this is a photograph taken from that project. What part of the routes we were following were next to an existing pipeline route, so we took advantage of what we could learn. And one thing we found were these large slabs of rock on the ground surface. So these slabs had been taken out of the pipe trench of this existing pipeline and placed to one side. Now this is my former colleague Jeff Fraser here. Now, just as I'm small, he is big. He's, if you think with his boots and hat on, he's probably close to 2 meters in height there. So we are looking at very thick slabs, and these are jury crusts. These are creted deposits, silcrete or mainly. And they have almost no fractures, so the size of the slab there is a function of the hammer breaking, not the size of the joint spacing. So these are really big problems for pipeline construction, and we need to understand them. So we need to go back in our time machine. And I very much like this paper by Mark Lee, Professor Fuchs, and my colleague Andrew Hart about the evolution of landforms in the Sahara, in the Algerian Sahara, but it applies to South Tunisia as well. And so they talk about the early part of the Tertiary and point out that the African plate, as we saw with Wegner, was 10 to 20 degrees south of its present condition, and it lay within a tropical rainforest. And it's this tropical condition, the hot, humid tropical conditions, and the intense tropical weathering that led to the formation of these jury crusts, the ferricretes and the silcretes. In the Algerian project, we had slightly different jury crusts, shown in this diagram that I drew for a paper that the team published in 2012, and it's just been coloured up. So we have bedrock. Over to the right, we have a wadi, an ephemeral stream, and then walking away from the stream along that slope, you come to soils which contain a floating jury crust. And notice the very extreme vertical exaggeration on this drawing. So if you were to make a pipe trench, say under the F of floating jury crust, you would want to understand how thick those jury crusts were. So understanding the environment in which they were formed is vitally important. So we can return now to the Lee et al. Paper, and later on in the Tertiary, the Atlas Mountains occur on the northern coast of Africa, widespread erosion, and then savanna, more humid conditions. So we're looking at a different set of conditions, more humid, higher water tables, and the formation of another layer or another generation of ferricrete and silcretes. And it could be that the examples I've shown you from that Insala project are from this period in time. But not only when you have a higher water table, you start to trigger different earth surface processes. You very seldom get landslides in a desert, but in a savanna with high water tables and storms, the landslides become reactivated. And understanding the activity and the behaviour of landslides becomes important for pipeline routing if you've got to take a pipeline up an escarpment or round the base of an escarpment, for example. And then, of course, desert conditions occur later on in the Tertiary, 7 million years ago. But that's not the end of all the changes in the Sahara. In the last 500,000 years or more, there have been a series of humid periods. Now, this rather complicated graph, which I've put together from two separate sources, begins, if you look at the black lines, these are the oxygen isotope stages of the last roughly 2,500 years. So these are the oxygen isotope ratios from microfossils from the ocean. And they're dated, and the ratio relates to the temperature, whether it's warm or cold. So if it's a low ratio, it means the conditions were warm, and if it's a cold ratio, it means if it's a higher ratio, it means the conditions are cold. So you get a graph going back in time of changes of climate. And the warm periods are conventionally numbered with odd numbers, because today we're in number 1, and it goes back, and you can see 3 isn't a very big warm period, then there's 5e, 7, and so forth. And then the colder periods, which are the glacial periods, are given even numbers. And then on this I've overlaid the African humid periods when Africa was particularly humid, and this is the so-called Green Sahara. And they occur, as you can see, this is from the work of Pausata, they occur almost entirely at the periods of warmth. So we're looking at a completely different condition. So if we go back to the last interglacial, what the European continental geologists call Eemian, we call Ipswichian, and this is about 125,000 years ago. If we go back then, we have, from Pausata's paper, a couple of maps here which we've redrawn, simplified, and then added colour to. And you can see in the present day on the left-hand side, we have the Sahara and a series of vegetational zones going south until you end up with a tropical rainforest on the equator or close to it. But in the Ipswichian, 125,000 years ago, in the Eemian AHP, it's very different. Notice the size of Lake Chad, for example. And notice that the bulk of the Sahara, including the two projects I've been talking about, are in wooded grassland, 10 to 40% tree cover. So what would that landscape have been look like? If we got in our time machine, what would that part of the Sahara have looked like? I think it might look something like this. This is a photograph that David Cliff has allowed me to use. This is savannah in Uganda. Rolling grassland, trees. Maybe there are more trees than that because people live here and perhaps they're chopping trees down for firewood. But compare this in your mind to that photograph where I was in Tunisia looking across the valley with the road in the distance. It's the same shape of landscape, but utterly different. The time machine helps us understand that, I suggest. So you could visit with the time machine deep in the early Tertiary, with these big slabs, maybe slightly later with floating jury crusts that follow the landscape, maybe in that later period. And then of course, we have these African humid periods and the effect that they've had on the landscape. How do we use all this information in our engineering assessment? Well, the techniques we use for pipeline routing and for other things is engineering terrain evaluation. And what we do is divide the landscape into a series of units, mappable units, shown here in different colours. And the idea is that a terrain unit has a range of engineering properties and geohazards and geological characteristics that are different from another terrain unit. So there's a range, but it's distinctively different from another one. And on this map, we've coloured them up in different colours. And you can see the rough idea of scale, the size of these terrain units, by looking at the kilometre points there. Kilometre point 285, 290, 5 kilometres along that pipeline route. Then we can systematically assess the engineering characteristics, the geohazards, and the other characteristics of the route and the terrain using the terrain units. So I've shown you here terrain unit SP, Southern Plains, which should be, you would expect, fairly good trenching conditions. And I'm talking about excavatability here, not other things, which might be the ability to construct a road or the looking for borrow materials. But this is just excavatability. And this is what we wrote in the report. Trench excavations may be difficult in parts of this terrain. There may be stronger jury crusts. Trenching equipment needs to be selected carefully, and the site investigation needs to think about those. We were doing reconnaissance level work. And almost certainly you're going to be able to excavate with a large backhoe excavator, but with a rock breaker of the sort I showed you from Oman on standby, should you encounter some of these jury crusts, which in this terrain unit were thought to be infrequent. And you could also consider the use of large trenching machines, really big machines that excavate a trench, but do not like stronger materials, like treated materials. So bringing this all together, you can make an assessment of excavatability. Right, we're going to Sussex. We're going to the River Arun, which is a lowland river in southern England, flows through the South Downs of Chalk, and you can see a chalk bit in the hillside there. The River Arun has the most spectacular curving meanders as it makes its way to the coast. And it makes its way to the coast at Littlehampton, and we're going to a little village called Burpham, which is just upstream of the historic town of Arundel. And the reason I was involved there is that I work with the Arundel Museum, and the museum decided to get together a little project working with the two archaeological institutes that you see there. And the reason for that was to look for the remains of elephants, or in other words mammoths, that had been found in the 1820s in a bed of gravel on the estate of John Druitt, and indeed in a bed of sand when it was described later on in 1824. And the idea was, let us see if we can find that bed of gravel and sand and see what could be found about the mammoth remains and the understanding of the geological conditions. Now you may think this is just digression, I'm indulging myself. Well, I am slightly, but I'm going to end up with describing to you what the lessons we could learn from this kind of work for engineering geological understanding of that type of landscape. So the River Arun is famous, and indeed the nearby River Ada is famous for its river terraces. And the Arun has 5, possibly 6 river terraces. It's only a small river. But what you'll see from this table, particularly if I go to the next slide, is that the river terrace gravels are all formed in glacial periods, either normally at the beginning or the end of the glacial period. So the Divensian, we have the first river terrace and the Buried Channel river terrace, for example, and we go through the later periods. So what we're looking for is a periglacial river terrace, because that's almost certainly where this sand and gravel came from. And this photograph, which I've got permission from Oxford Archaeology to use, well actually it's an image, isn't it, is the sort of thing we have in mind. So you think of periglacial braided rivers in lowland England, or lowland Britain, and this is what you have in mind. Well, they're the mammoths we're looking for, and there possibly are the humans. We would be lovely if we found a stone tool or indeed the remains of human occupation. But that's the target, and this is the mental model with our time machine as what we're looking for. The River Arun today looks like this. So in the background we have the chalk hills. The River Arun flows through on its floodplain, and I'm standing on the hillside overlooking a field of sheep, and lurking in that hillside are the degraded remnants of river terraces, of a river terrace. And that's the terrain we looked at. Now, the archaeologists on the team and the people who looked in detail at the historical documents were able to identify an area that was worth investigating as a potential location for the river terrace, even though it wasn't that obvious. And this is an auger hole that we put down. We put down more than half a dozen auger holes, hand auger, and I can tell you that 2.5 meters of hand augering in this kind of terrain is not easy. We had a couple of big blokes, fortunately, who did the bulk of the work. But as you can see, down to 2.5 meters, there's topsoil, there's head or colluvium. So this is solifluction material. Then there's a layer of brick earth, so this is the wind-blown dust from the glacial period, more head, and it's covering over the river terrace deposits. So we were delighted to find the sand, as in that historical report, and the borehole stopped, refused at 2.5 metres, either on a flint cobble, which might mean there's gravel underneath, or perhaps on the chalky bedrock. We couldn't tell. So I got back home, and I got a scrap of paper, and I drew this little cross-section, just in my mind. We all do this, don't we? I had one in my notebook in the field, but I just tidied it up to send around the team. So looking from left to right, we have the current floodplain with its first river, the floodplain terrace gravels underneath, and then there's the terrace that we investigated uphill. So that's the one in red, with the red arrow showing the auger hole. And then, because I knew that there are a series of other terraces on this hillside, on the River Arun Valley, there must have been others rising up, which have no doubt been degraded away by that solifluction process. Because some of our other boreholes, you can see the one to the right there, numbers 1 and 3, just encounter chalk beneath the topsoil. My sketch was produced in 2017, and sometime later, I bought a copy of the great big thick Geological Engineering Group's publication on periglacial and recently glaciated terrain, the Working Party report. I'm delighted to find the paper in there by Merton and Ballantyne, which has this marked up and coloured up cross-section. And by taking my cross-section and getting rid of my outrageous vertical exaggeration, I was really delighted that what I'd drawn was broadly what they showed. But even better than that, look in the red circle. Fluvial gravel, sand and silt, plus minus vertebrate remains. These are mammoths. These are Neanderthals and flint implements. We didn't find them, but that's for another day. Sometime later, the geophysics work that we did was reported to us, and this is the geophysics cross-section. The vertical blue arrow shows that borehole I've shown you, auger hole 7, and used by the geophysics interpreters to correlate. And the bottom of the terrace is shown by that blue arrow. So I was delighted that all these 3 pieces of information all fitted together rather nicely. The conceptual understanding, the auger hole itself, and the geophysics. Well, what has this got to do with engineering geology? Well, I'll give you some thoughts. The first one is that the multidisciplinary approach, we had a whole range of disciplines there, enabled us to achieve more than if an individual discipline had been there. That's a well-known truth, but it's worth saying we need multidisciplinary teams. The time machine enabled us to go back to the periglacial conditions and looking at the modern conditions, and then it's going to help us manage the risk for ground engineering works. Now, I have to stress that there is absolutely no intention whatsoever to develop that part of the Arun Valley. It's in the South Downs National Park, but I'm just using it to illustrate, as an illustrative example, if we investigate similar terrain somewhere else. The first thing is, there's a variable chalk rock head. Secondly, a localised occurrence of superficial deposits that are granular, the river terraces. So if you imagine you were trying to build, say, a bridge abutment somewhere there, and you were putting down some boreholes, one borehole might discover chalk just beneath the turf. Another one might encounter the granular superficial deposits, in other words, a terrace. We know the terraces are infrequent because of subsequent erosion. So the correlation of boreholes becomes more rational if you understand the three-dimensional geological model built on your understanding of the processes. Think of the time machine. And then, of course, because we're dealing with periglacial deposits, we have relic shear surfaces in the colluvium. But another thing that occurred to me as I was putting the paper together is that the farmer was digging a hole in this terrace. He wanted the sand and gravel for some use on the farm. He left a hole. Holes are extremely valuable. They get filled with rubble, with waste, with brick rubble perhaps, but they might be filled with contaminated material. So understanding this three-dimensional arrangement also has a great bearing on geo-environmental projects. Dearie me, I didn't show you that. I do apologise. That's what I've been talking about. I told you I'd get into trouble with these multiple buttons to press. Now we're going offshore. We're going offshore Brighton. And offshore Brighton is the Rampion wind farm. This is a photograph I took a couple of years ago, and I managed to take a photograph of a wind farm that doesn't just have wind turbines. So I was quite pleased with that. And the Rampion wind farm is offshore Brighton, as I said. And there are, in fact, two Rampion wind farms. There's the one that's operational, which Atkins has worked on. We did a lot of ground characterization work as input into the foundation design of the monopiles for the wind turbines. And that's Rampion 1, shown in the yellow here. But there's Rampion 2. Rampion 2 is the next phase, and it's currently being investigated. And I have to say, it's not the size that you see there. It's going to be approximately the size of Rampion 1. What you see there is the outline of the environmental scoping area. So this is where a lot of environmental work is being done. It's not going to be covered in wind turbines. And I've got this from published work by Wood there. Now, because we're dealing with the channel, with the coast, we need to think about sea level rise. If we go back 20-odd thousand years, 24,000 years, we're in the middle of the last ice age, in the middle of the Divensian, the last glacial maximum. And during the last glacial maximum, the sea level was 130 metres below where it is today. And what this graph shows, which is well known, and I've given the references there, is that the progressive rise of sea level as the glaciers melted. And we've just drawn an envelope around the individual data points. This is what happens to the English Channel if you lower the sea level by 130 metres. It's all dry land. And the Channel has a very large river, the Channel River, a network of rivers, which collects the water from the major rivers of northwest Europe and indeed from Britain. You can see the Solent River there, perhaps, around the Isle of Wight, and the River Thames flows into this. We want to zoom in. We're going to go there. We're going to go to the Rampion wind farm area. Zooming in again, you can see the River Arun there and the River Ada, but there's something strange about this map. For some reason, and I don't know why, the River Arun doesn't flow across the seafloor, across what was dry land and ending up in the northern Paleo Valley. And I think this is just due to lack of data, because the original work was by Antoine in 2003, long before the detailed geophysics was done, I suspect. And it's modified slightly by Merton and Ballantyne, but they didn't insert the river there. But all is not lost. So I've gone back to that original map. Now this is our work on the Rampion 1 wind farm. And what those red areas are the positions of paleo channels that we identified from many, many hundreds of kilometres of geophysics data. So these are the paleo channels. This is what the rivers from the coast as we see it today will have done if they flowed southwards to the Channel River. But also I've shown here a little red squiggly line. This is a line published by Professor Gupta of Imperial College in 2008. This is his assessment of the centre line of the Paleo Arun. So the River Arun goes to Littlehampton, and then it works its way across what is now the seafloor, but would have been dry land, across the Rampion 2 area, and ends up with a little kick at the end. Now, I can't use it, but if you were to go onto the internet, you will find other publications about Rampion 2, And some of them contain interpretations of the geophysics. And it looks just like the interpretations we had on Rampion 1. And furthermore, they show the position of the main channel of the Arun almost exactly where Professor Gupta placed it. So that's rather warming. Now, the importance of these channels is that wind farm, the monopile turbines, do not like being founded in the materials that are to be found within a river channel. Loose gravels, soft clays, silts and peats. So the key point is the presence of those areas coloured in red are places where you don't want to put your wind turbine if you can avoid it, because you have to design very special foundations. So they are hazard zones. So if we now go back to our sea level rise graph and we think about 2 times visits with a time machine, you could visit when the sand and gravel was being formed and try to evaluate those kind of conditions, and you could visit much later on when the climate is ameliorated, sea level is rising, and the River Arun is depositing clays and silts and sands and peats. So here we are, we're back in our time machine. That's the image I showed you before. Periglacial conditions, braided rivers, gravel bed rivers. But then we can go to the Holocene, and this is a Mesolithic period, if you're into archaeological periods. And I found this report. The seabed of the River Arun in the late Mesolithic. So this is a publication by Wessex Archaeology, who are an archaeological organisation that specialise in marine archaeology. And I've shown on the right one of the river channels that we identified at Rampion 1. It's about 2 kilometres wide. So if we were to get in our time machine and land just in front of that little tree, you could have a talk with our prehistoric ancestor and look at this landscape. This is what the River Arun looked like, say, 8,000 years ago. And it's these conditions that the wind turbines have to avoid, because you can't have easily turbines built in those kinds of fine-grained conditions, including the presence of peats. Now, when I was putting my paper together, I sent a draft to some colleagues, and one of them came back and said, one of the key points you must stress, David, is that communication is so important. The time machine is more than an aid to getting technical things right. It's an opportunity to blow the trumpet for science communication. It's a way of engaging people. And I think it's, as this author wrote as well, it's about understanding and thinking of risks and discussing them with clients. It's an engaging way of attracting their attention. Say the mechanical engineers don't know much about geology, but the kind of approach I've talked about, I've found to be successful. The other big comment that came back was, where are the skills? Have we got the training, the knowledge, the experience? What training do we need? What does each of us bring to projects? How do we ensure that these skills are passed on through the generations? And anyway, are we sufficiently trained in a wide range of geologies and settings, as I've tried to illustrate this evening, to be effective time travellers, not just focusing on one set of geological conditions, one particular small part of the world? Now, the concept of the time machine, as I said at the beginning, is more than a factual description. You take yourself back in time, you're an observer, you then apply that understanding. So to paraphrase what Peter Fuchs said in 1997, the power of the geoscience time machine is more than its ability to understand and anticipate conditions. Just getting in a muddle here. The past can be the present of somewhere else. The present is the key to the past, is well known. But I think the time machine is slightly different from that. It's the past of a site or a region can be represented by the present of somewhere else. So by doing so, the time machine can aid our thinking, our understanding and conceptualization of the ground. So I believe it's an essential tool, and time travelling can be done throughout the life of a project. You can do it at desk study, at field reconnaissance stage. You can do it at detailed investigation stage, and indeed construction. And heaven forbid, you could also do it when things go wrong. So what skills do we need? Develop powers of visualization and imagination. Maintain a broad interest in the geosciences. Identify and understand present-day conditions and processes as analogues, and I think make really good use of case studies to engage interest. So that's the end of the technical part of my lecture. So I just must say the thank yous. First of all, I must acknowledge organisations and people who have allowed me to use hitherto unpublished information. So the trustees of Arundel Museum and the Duke and Duchess of Norfolk, on whose land the Burpham investigation was carried out. Barry Wilson of the Quarry Company in Devon, and Paul Andrews, who was project director for the South Tunisia gas line project. In my published paper, I'm going to reference everything properly and give proper assignments. And very lastly, acknowledgements to people. In thinking about this list, I felt I had to begin with the people who were pivotal in my training at university. So Dr. Bill Cummins was my tutor at the University of Nottingham, and I spent a year after that at the University of Cambridge studying archaeology under Dr. John Alexander. And I use that knowledge frequently. It's just part of the way I'm wired, and I have a feeling there may be people in the room who are wired in the same way. Professor Peter Fuchs, of course, has been an enormous influence on my life. I've worked with him for many years. He was my mentor, a severe critic, and I'm pleased to say a friend. But 3 other Glossop lecturers have been particularly influential in my career. Mike Sweeney, who's in the room today, Professor Dennis Brunson, and Dr. Mike de Freitas, who's also in the room today. But also Mark Lee, who is again in the room today, I'm pleased to say. Mark and I, paths have crossed on a number of occasions, and I've learned so much from him about geomorphology, about engineering geomorphology, reading the landscape. I must thank my former and current managing directors at Atkins, Dermot Sweeney, David French, Ron Morley and Andrew Benson. And I must thank my colleagues at Atkins. There are too many to mention, so I thought I'd just mention the ones who've been instrumental in helping me put this together. Steve Coates, Stephen Fort, Dr. Andrew Hart, Tracy Radford and Jessica Smith. But also Ashley King. Ashley King put together much of the illustrations where I've said something's been coloured in or redrawn was done by Ashley. Thank you to you all. And last but not least, I must thank my family. I thank my wife Pauline, who's put up with so much over many years. My children, Robert and Catherine, they're all 3 in the room today. And my late father, Michael, and his brother, Paul, who sparked and engaged my interest in geology. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, David, for that fascinating Glossop lecture. I'd now like to call upon Stephen Fort, Atkins Chief Geotechnical Engineer, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you. After lockdown, I need to use these. Wow, David, that was impressive. Good evening, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honour and pleasure for me to give tonight's vote of thanks for David's wonderful presentation of the 21st Glossop Lecture. Well worth the additional weight in these challenging times. The challenge for me, however, will be trying to keep these thanks brief. I first came across David many years ago, traipsing on the beaches of Lyme Regis on the Jurassic coast, whilst we were both separately tendering for a scheme. And then over a decade ago, I was fortunate to join Atkins and work with David on many UK and overseas projects. These projects included those with unique and challenging geohazards, such as collapsible, sulfate-rich and weathered soils, and of course areas of landsliding. Geohazards which cover much of the globe. The success of these projects has benefited enormously from David's use of field observation, reading the ground terrain, its geomorphology, geology, and crucially his comprehensive understanding of geological processes, i.e. going back to basics. During this period I've seen how David has brought his time-gathered knowledge, expertise and questioning mind and guidance to all those who have worked with him, from graduates starting their careers to his peers and also his numerous appreciative clients. David's special contribution to our profession is his forever questioning and challenging thought process of how time and space has influenced today's environment, and how David has translated such geo-environmental observations to the likely way in which a site will respond in the present day. All of this helping to identify, address and mitigate geotechnical risks and hazards encountered during the construction and operation of projects. This tenacity brings to mind one occasion when David and I, with our good wives, went to the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival a few years ago. Amongst crowded stands with dinosaurs, ammonites and polished stones, our JOLSOC had a lonely stand with a not too exciting table draped with a few leaflets. To spruce this up and to encourage visitors, David went out onto the beach and collected a pile of pebbles of mixed geology and placed them on the JOLSOC table. Crowds of visitors then flocked to the stand where David proceeded to tell to tell the visitors the story of these rocks, again instilling his enthusiasm to others. Do you remember that day?
I remember the fish side.
In time-mannered form, David, standing on the shoulders of the first Glossop lecturer, the late Professor Peter Fuchs, is forever with his notebook sketching out his conceptual ground model of the site, as we've seen in today's lecture, and how this model relates to the proposed development, be it a road, pipeline, wind farm or structure. This thought process has been illustrated clearly in what we have all heard in David's lecture tonight, by letting us have brief access to his virtual GeoTARDIS time-travelling machine. We have seen the importance of mentally projecting ourselves to the environment in which it was formed, using parallels of today, and then observing the influence of time and space in obtaining a better understanding of how it has reached its current condition. I and many others have been very fortunate and privileged to be on board David's time machine on many projects. Throughout his career, David has made an enormous personal contribution to our profession, showing his enthusiasm, energy, diligence and commitment, and how he has shared this knowledge with those who have worked with him. So, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I propose a vote of thanks to David for presenting a fantastic, stimulating and thought-provoking 21st Glossop Lecture, and to his enormous contribution to both our society and to engineering geology. Thank you, David.
Many thanks, Stephen. I'm sure you'll all be delighted to learn that David Shilston's Glossop Lecture will be published in Quarterly Journal of Engineering, Geology and Hydrology in 2022. I'd now like to call upon Emma Slack to make the presentations to the award winners. David, if you'd like to join us first. Stand there and then take photos.
Oh, thank you. To look at it. Oh, I think I should look at it. Thank you very much. It's an honour.
Excellent. Josh didn't know he was getting this.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. And the engineering group would like to thank Emma and John for their continued support. Right. So now we jump back to the future. and 2022. I'm delighted to announce that the 22nd Glossop Lecture will be given by Professor John Harrison. The lecture is provisionally titled, "Are you sure? Rethinking Geotechnical Uncertainty in Rock Mechanics." John Harrison is a civil engineering graduate who, after 6 years in the civil engineering industry, joined the academic staff at Imperial College London, where he undertook research into rock mechanics and rock engineering. Since 2010, he has held the position of W.M. Keck, Chair of Engineering Rock Mechanics at the University of Toronto, Canada. During his career, he has worked on a number of challenging rock engineering projects and has undertaken research into a range of key rock mechanics problems. Over the past decade, he has been closely involved in developing the rock mechanics and rock engineering aspects of the forthcoming revision of Eurocode 7. Much of his recent research has been focused on tackling the problems that geological, geotechnical and rock mechanics uncertainty brings to rock engineering design. Because of this, his answer to a rock engineering question will frequently be, he's not sure. Wider engineering group events early in 2022 include, on the 2nd of February is the application deadline for the Jeremy Ingham Research Fund. This is a recently instituted fund of £2,000 awarded annually for research into engineering geology, with preference given to study of construction materials and or research incorporating the use of petrological techniques. Further information is available from the geological website along with application forms. A few days later, on the 8th of February, we have the annual joint British Geotechnical Association Engineering Group meeting with Dr. Tim Newman presenting on the engineering geology of the Thames Tideway and its effects on construction performance. 31st of March to the 2nd of April, we have our postponed annual conference at Christ's College, Cambridge, on the theme of the role of the engineering geologist in the climate change challenge. I'm advised that we have both spaces and sponsorship opportunities available. In March and April, we have 2 working party updates. On the 9th of March, the Coastal and Nearshore Engineering, Geology, Geomorphology and Geohazards Working Party will report. This is a new engineering group special publication working party and is a companion to the work being presented on the 6th of April by the Offshore Engineering, Geology, Geomorphology and Geohazards Working Party. Chris, you've got to get better, snappier titles. The engineering group special publication is nearing completion and due for publication later in 2022. Lastly, before summer break, on the 8th of June, we have Martin Ziegler presenting on the stability of rock-cut tombs and cliffs in Thebes limestone, Luxor in Egypt. The planning of the 2022 field trip is underway and we will be announcing details in due course. It only remains for me to thank you all for coming and to wish you all a safe journey home. Good night.